Now live, if you want to introduce yourself.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Wenokor. I'm a student at Rutgers University in New Brunswick right now. I'm in about my third year studying what is known as biomedical engineering. And biomedical engineering can be all sorts of things. It can be, tissue engineering, growing your tissues. It can be what I want to do, which is orthopedics. If you've ever known anyone who's had a hip replacement or a knee replacement, those are the kinds of devices I would like to be designing in my future. At Rutgers, I took a class this semester, completely out of the blue, called Biomedical Engineering for Astrospace. And all it talks about is just the different environments that you get in space that are, very different from what we have here on Earth, and how that affects the human body in different ways. And during my presentation, I'll be going through various different body systems. There's not time to cover all of them. There's a vast array of material, but I'll touch on things, and hopefully you guys can learn something. Maybe even Ms. Grant will learn something, and we'll just have a fun time here with this presentation. So on that note,
okay, so we're going to go to
I'd like to add that Rebecca Wenokor was also a student in my 6th grade science class. Well, it's her brother, Gregory, that's with us down. Ms. Malaspina?
I am trying to get us to where we need to be.
What is started over here? What is she?
oh man.
She come over here. She stood here. Possible?
Don't worry about it. I think we're okay.
But then you would be able to see her if she was on this. No?
Give me a sec.
Okay.
Hold on. How many seconds?
Hold on.
Here, hold on. Whoa!
I know, that's... Sorry.
Whoa!
Okay, that's what I need. Start screen share. So now, now the Prezi is
Now
live.
the Prezi is going?
Yep,
Are we-
it should be
So
good.
you,
good
if
to
you
go?
operate the
You want a full
Prezi,
screen?
she's standing here so you can see her better in the presentation, Ms. Malaspina?
She's not shown on the presentation. Everything
Oh,
right
now
now
it's
you're
Prezi.
seeing is the Prezi.
Okay. So before I start off, I want to ask you guys if you know any ways that outer space is different from being here on Earth. Any? Oh man, wow, you guys are super smart. I'm going to start, just go around the room. Yes, sir, would you like to start?
In outer space, there's no gravity.
That
and,
is true.
When you go on a planet, there's gravity and atmosphere and stuff.
Yes.
Like in outer space, there's like a lot of oxygen, so we have to wear like spacesuits.
Absolutely.
Talk loud, guys.
Yes.
We have the strongest atmosphere.
Yeah, we do have a stronger atmosphere here on Earth than we do in space.
In space, there's no sound.
Yep. Any others? Okay, great. So you guys are off to a great head start. We can move on. Oh, wow. How did we do that? Okay, move
There.
forward. That was just introducing me. I did that already. So I'm going to start going through the different body systems, and we're going to start off with the cardiovascular system. So again, have you guys learned about the cardiovascular system? Do you know anything about it at all? No? Okay, cool. Yes, in the back. It absolutely does. Good job. So the cardiovascular system is made up of your heart, your blood vessels that go from your heart to your body, which are your arteries, your capillaries, which are just very, very small blood vessels, and then your veins, which bring blood back to your heart. And on Earth, the cardiovascular system is used to a certain amount of gravity. And so when your heart is pumping blood, it's pumping against gravity to pump it up to your head, and it's also pumping very hard to pump the blood down through your feet and back up again. And then there's also different mechanisms that exist in your legs, in the veins in your legs, to help pump the blood back up against gravity. And so this diagram here is showing the normal kind of distribution of blood in the body. So the first one on the left, is just, in regular, Earth environments, how's the blood spread out in the body. There's a decent amount of blood in the head, there's a lot around the heart and lungs, and then there's also a decent amount in the feet just because it's still very hard for the body to push all that blood up against gravity. What happens, though, when a person goes to space, as you can see in the following picture, is that immediately after they go into a low-gravity environment, there's still all these things happening in their body to push blood back to the heart, especially from the lower extremities like the feet. And so the heart is still pumping, you know, your veins in your legs are still pumping the blood up. And so instead of being normally distributed, all the blood kind of moves up to the upper part of the body. And you have way too much blood in your chest and in your head because the body's still acting like there's gravity. It's still pushing everything back up, but there's no gravity to counteract that. So what ends up happening is the body gets very confused, and it thinks, oh man, I have all this fluid up here. There's too much fluid everywhere. It doesn't understand that the fluid just moves. It thinks there's too much. So the person will start peeing a lot, and they won't want to drink as much because they won't want to take in as much fluid. And so they actually end up having just a lot less fluid in general in their entire body, which is kind of shown in the third picture. And that's fine in space, but problems arise when a person is in space for a very long time and their body adapts to having less fluid, and then they come back to Earth. So we can move on and I'll show some of those things. So one of the things that's affected is the heart. The heart is a big, strong muscle, and its job is to pump blood. And when there's less blood and there's also less gravity and less pressure to pump against, the heart doesn't need to do as much work anymore. So what does it do? It gets really lazy and it gets weak. And the heart will actually, after a long time in space, decrease in size, and the muscle will atrophy, which means that it will get very weak. Moving on. And something that I was talking about earlier with the veins in your legs is that those will also weaken. So right up top there on the left, there's a picture of what your arteries look like, which are the vessels that bring blood from the heart to the body. And then on next to it, there's a vein. And the structures are very different. So arteries are usually thinner and surrounded by a decent amount of muscle, and veins are thicker. There's more blood in your veins at all times in your body, and they have these valves. And what's interesting about these valves is that they're one of the two main things that help pump blood back up from very far away from the heart back to the heart. And the way this works, as you can see on the bottom right here, is kind of that the valves only allow blood to flow back up. So right now there's like a decent amount of blood there. It's not really going anywhere. And the vein is surrounded by muscle, and it's relaxed. And then anytime you move, or even when you're not really consciously moving, your muscles are always contracting lightly. And when the muscles contract, they push the blood back up. And then it's kind of this motion of like pushing, and then the valves closing off. And that's one of the ways how your body gets blood all the way from your legs to your heart. Once again, in space, your muscles are weakening because you don't need them as much. And if this mechanism isn't as necessary anymore, the valves can also weaken, or they can kind of take on abnormal shapes. And so when the person comes back to Earth, and they're in this environment again with gravity, the mechanisms that are supposed to be helping them pump blood back to the heart are weakened, and they can't really do it anymore. So,
It's better if I can stop for 1 second.
yeah, sure.
Really pay attention to this, because some of this information she's giving you can use in your work. In your projects, in your presentations, because your gravity is going to be different on whatever planet or moon you're doing. So really think about and listen to what she's saying, because that's what I'm thinking, that I'd like to hear something. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so the kind of last step of this process in the last picture here is when the person comes back to Earth, and they're, you know, as I said, they're much weaker than they were when they first left, and so a lot of the blood will just go all the way back down and pool in their legs. And that's a big problem because if your blood is all in your legs, guess where it's not? It's not in your brain. And your brain needs blood to supply with oxygen so that you don't faint. We can look forward. And so it's very common for astronauts when they return from space to not really be able to stand or walk on their own for a bit. And if they do, they'll faint very quickly. So here's a picture of, I believe, a Russian astronaut. Oh, no, it's fine. Who came back from space mission, and I'm sure he's, you know, doing all right, but he can't stand by himself, and, you know, that's a problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit, moving on, about what's done to counteract this problem of what's called fluid shift during different parts in space flight. And so the number one thing that astronauts do, and this is to help them with all sorts of problems, is they do a lot of exercise while they're up in space, especially if they're on the space station for long periods of time. They need to keep their muscles in shape, they need to keep their bones in shape, and so they exercise. And I always think it's so interesting when you look at pictures from the space station, how every little thing that they have to do is, you know, so much more complicated. Simple tasks like running on a treadmill, you know, you see that guy, he's all strapped in. And why is that? Because there's no gravity. So if, you know, he wasn't strapped in, he'd just be running through thin air and he would no longer be exercising. So every time they need to do any tasks, they need to be strapped in. So that's one thing they can do. Once they come back to Earth, they can wear special suits. On the bottom, you can see what's called an anti-G suit, and that's really just like very, very tight pants that make it impossible for the blood to pool in your legs. It'll just literally push it back up. And this is a concept that's actually not only used for space, but also used in regular life. Sometimes elderly people get pooling of blood in their legs just because their blood vessels are getting weaker, and sometimes they'll actually wear special socks or something that do basically the same thing. They don't look quite as intense as those, but they also just push the blood back up. Or they can wear that really awesome looking thing right there, which is an assisted walking suit, which is kind of just like a robotic suit almost to help them take some of the pressure off. So they'll be walking with the suit, and the suit will be holding them up a little bit so that they don't have to do the full walking motion on their own. So that's the cardiovascular system. Any questions?
Yeah. You know how you were talking about the G suit thing? Isn't it like the same thing for scuba diving too? Because you get like the blood stuff.
I'm actually not sure. I can definitely look into that. I know there are definitely similarities between going into space and going underwater. Again, I think as you were mentioning, because of pressure differences. So that's entirely possible. I'll look into it. Any other questions?
You were saying how like when people or astronauts return back to Earth, like their muscles and veins become weaker.
Mm-hmm.
Do they like adapt again, like back to Earth again? Eventually?
Yeah, they'll adapt back again. It just takes some time. Yeah.
Has this changed, like, with the blood being in their legs or being like too much, like above their legs? Has it ever killed somebody? Can it be fatal?
I'm sure it can be, but we certainly didn't hear anything about it in the class that I took. Usually, you know, people will faint, they'll go unconscious, and then they'll be taken care of. And especially these astronauts, they have entire teams of people monitoring them and watching them. So when they do faint, they'll be taken care of very quickly. Good question. Yeah.
Well, you said that they stop, like astronauts returning to Earth would not drink as much like fluids. So how would that affect like their hydration levels?
They actually stop, they drink less when they go into space, and it will definitely make them more dehydrated, absolutely. So that's really, you know, that's pretty unhealthy for them. But the body can adapt to at least a range of different hydration levels. But yeah, no, absolutely. You're more dehydrated. Any other questions? Yes?
Like when the astronauts exercise, wouldn't it mean like they're doing less work because there's less gravity? So like, wouldn't they like get the same amount of results if they did the same thing on Earth, but just it was easier?
So yeah, there's no gravity in space. And if they weren't strapped down or, whatever apparatus they have, they wouldn't actually be really doing any exercise, so wouldn't do anything. But usually, the exercise machines that they design for astronauts in space are especially like with that in mind, so that they're not dependent on gravity, or that they have something to strap them in to simulate the gravity. Otherwise, it would be, it wouldn't do anything. Okay, I'm going to move on.
Okay,
so
yes. Screen share is not cooperating as well as it should.
So what time do I have until?
About 14, 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so
Yeah. One sec.
okay, because of time constraints, I probably won't take any more questions to the end. But you guys are great question askers. Very impressed.
Okay. Let's hope this works. The video may be a problem, but we'll figure it out.
Okay, that's fine. So next I'm going to talk about the musculoskeletal system, which is your skeleton and your muscles. And something that's really important to kind of realize is that your bones are not these just, hard, dead objects. They're not like this table or, like a rock or something. They're living tissue, and they're constantly remodeling. And so there's two different types of cells, for the most part, that are involved in this process. You have cells called osteoclasts and cells called osteoblasts. And the osteoclasts will go in, they'll kind of eat up old bone that's getting weak and fragile, and then the osteoblasts will come in and they'll lay down new bone. And they don't always do this in the same pattern. The body is constantly reevaluating, how much bone do I need right now, and how does it decide that? It decides that by the amount of activity that the person is doing, or the amount of stress that they're putting on their bones. So if the person is doing a lot of vigorous exercise, if they're running marathons, if they're weightlifting, then their body will actually put on a little bit more bone mass to support that. Whereas if someone's, spending all day in bed every day, they'll actually lose bone mass. And this becomes a problem for astronauts because, as we've been talking about, there's less gravity. So they're putting like significantly less amounts of stress on their bones, and they'll start losing bone mass, and their bones will become very weak. And I have two pretty interesting videos that I want to show you. So the first one, wait, don't play yet.
No? Okay, I'm gonna stop.
So this one's a little bit in depth, but I think it's really pretty and it's really well done, so I wanted to show it to you. And it's explaining how the osteoclasts eat up the bone, the osteoblasts lay down new bone. So.
Bone is a dynamic tissue that is continually being built, broken down, and rebuilt in a process called bone remodeling. Bone tissue is broken down and resumed by multinucleated cells known as osteoclasts. These cells are derived from monocytes, which originate within bone marrow. Osteoclasts play an important role in liberating minerals and other molecules stored within the bone matrix. Bone tissue serves as a repository for vital minerals, including calcium phosphate and various biologically active molecules, such as growth factors. The release of calcium from the bone can play a role in maintaining its homeostasis within the body. The cells responsible for building new bone tissue are known as osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are thought to be derived from cells found to be associated with blood vessels. Once active, they start to produce the organic component of bone, osteoid, which is predominantly made of collagen. Minerals start to crystallize around the collagen scaffold to form hydroxyapatite, the major inorganic constituent of bone, which contains calcium phosphate. Bone mineral density, or BMD, can be used to estimate the strength of bone and to assess the risk of fracture. As osteoblasts form new bone tissue, many become embedded within the matrix and differentiate into osteocytes. The structure, composition, and cellular processes that occur within bone allow it to simultaneously serve as a calcium reservoir, while providing structural support for the vital organs and for locomotion.
Okay, so that was all about different bone cell types, and I think we're going to skip the next video just out of time constraints. But what I was touching on earlier was that in microgravity, there's less stress on the bone, and so the body will assume that you do not want or do not need this bone anymore, and that it can eat it up and use those minerals and that calcium elsewhere. And so what happens is the bone becomes more porous and weaker. And so here's a picture of, this isn't from an astronaut, this is from someone with osteoporosis, which is a disease that people get as they age, mostly women. And it has nothing to do with space travel, but what you see between astronauts who have a lot of loss of bone mass and between osteoporosis patients is very similar. So on the left you have a normal person, and that's their spongy bone. It's very dense. I mean, it still has pores, but you can see there's a lot more there than in the person with osteoporosis. And there's also, like, not on a microscopic level, but on a macroscopic level, this is, you know, if you take a long bone and you kind of cut out a slice, you can see in the cross-section that usually the walls are fairly thick, but if you decrease the stress on the bone a lot, the walls will thin out. And what happens when your bone is porous, when it's thin, it breaks really easily. You can, you know, slip on the ice, and then all of a sudden you need a hip replacement or whatever. So people generally don't want that. And just a little tangent that, again, this is something that I didn't expect at all. I thought it was really interesting. Thing that I learned in this class is that the bone remodeling actually also has negative effects on your excretory system. So your kidneys, your bladder, all of that is your excretory system. And what the bones are, other than a structural support for your body, is they're actually a really large calcium reservoir. So your body needs calcium for all sorts of reasons. Your nerves need calcium, your muscles need calcium to function, and most of the calcium is stored in your bones. And so when the bone remodels, it releases all the calcium from the bones into your bloodstream. And just like too little calcium can be bad, too much calcium can be bad, because where does that calcium in the blood go? It filters through the kidneys filter out the calcium, but then the kidneys can't really handle all that calcium and you get kidney stones. And I've never had a kidney stone, but I've heard that they're extremely painful, and sometimes you need surgery to get them out. So that's a really nasty side effect of the bone remodeling. But yeah, back to the musculoskeletal system. As I mentioned earlier, along with the bones, all of your skeletal muscles that you're not using as much will weaken and atrophy if the astronauts don't exercise enough. It's actually not completely all of the muscles, so maybe having a hand here isn't the best picture, because astronauts actually put a lot of stress on their hands when they wear those big bulky spacesuits and they have to do little tasks. They actually, they use their hands a lot. They get a lot of exercise in their hands. So in certain choice places, the muscles may actually get stronger from all that use, but overall, the muscles will get weaker. And again, problem when you come back to Earth and you can no longer support your body weight, or you just have such a decrease in muscle mass. Okay. So, again, keep going. So what can be done about issues with the musculoskeletal system is, again, exercise, which we already talked about, and also creating artificial gravity on spaceships or on space stations. And the reason why I have a picture of a carnival ride up here is not because they want to put carnival rides on spaceships, but because I want to try and explain this concept of centripetal force, which you guys may not hear about until high school physics. But kind of what centripetal force is a force that's felt when you spin things around in a circle. And I don't know how many of you have ever been on a ride like this at Six Flags or something, but what happens in the ride is you walk into this ride, and first you're standing on a platform, and you go to a wall and you stand next to the wall, and just for safety, maybe they'll have a seatbelt or something, and they'll start spinning you around in circles, and you can start feeling this force that pushes you against the wall. And eventually that force is so strong that they can actually let the floor out under you, and you'll just be pinned against the wall. But the reason I'm explaining all of this is because that's what centripetal force is. It's that force that's pushing you. And that same idea can be used to create artificial gravity in space, because that force that you can create with centripetal force can be used to mimic gravity. And you can do that kind of larger scale ways, like in the 1950s, this guy named von Braun came up with a model for this kind of toroid, which is really just a fancy name for donut shape, space station. And this thing works by kind of just rotating in a circle, and it creates a centripetal force, and the people walking inside there can feel that force, and it actually feels like there's gravity. They're walking on the ground. And you can control how much artificial gravity there is by making the station bigger or spinning it faster. But these space stations, I don't know how much they've actually been implemented, because it would take a decent amount of energy to keep spinning that space station around. And as far as using it as a spaceship or something, I have no idea if that's aerodynamic at all. Regardless, they're trying to kind of create, instead of entire space stations, just little devices where maybe they'll spin people around in the circle for a certain amount of time, and then they get their daily gravity dosage. So I actually have a little video of that, of something being developed at MIT, which is a university in Massachusetts, and it looks really silly, or maybe just really bad. It might make you really nauseous, I don't know. And that guy's just being spun around, and he's probably feeling that force. Okay. He just keeps doing that. So, yep, just forever and ever and ever. Okay, so that's, a couple of ideas. The next body system I'm going to go over, oh no, okay, that's fine. You can do that, is the vestibular system, which is the body system that allows you to orient yourself in space. So right now, if I turn my head to the side, I know that I'm turning my head to the side. It's not confusing me, and I can move my head up and down. And the system exists in the ear, specifically the inner ear. So your ear is used, everyone knows, to hear, but it's also used to keep your balance and to orient yourself. And that's done with that little blue structure called the inner ear. And I guess I'll just talk about the inner ear for a little bit. It's very interesting. So there's kind of two main components of the inner ear. One of them measures how you're moving translationally, which is shown right here. So you have this little pocket called the vestibule, and inside the vestibule you have two structures called the utricle, which is kind of laying flat, and the saccule, which is standing up. And both of these structures have cells at the base that have little hairs on them, little hair cells. They're not really actually hairs, they're just kind of like little protrusions of the cell. And these protrusions are in a gel, and on the gel are really dense little stones called otoliths. And the way these things work is every time you move, the stones kind of pull the gel in one direction or the other, and by pulling the gel, they also pull the hair cells, and the hair cells can register that movement, and they can send signals to the brain saying, hey, I'm moving in this direction, I'm moving up, I'm moving down. And that's how the brain registers whether you're right side up or right side down. And obviously these operate with gravity. Gravity is really important. So like the one that's facing this way, it's always being pulled down constantly all the time for all of us right now. Because there's gravity, and so when astronauts go into space, there's a lot of kind of confusion with these signals because they're not feeling gravity, so it's hard for them to orient themselves. And then we can move on to, we're just
getting to the end.
Yeah. Okay, well I can okay.
You can maybe send Miss Grandpa.
Yeah, I can do that.
She can actually finish it. Can she finish it, Miss Valentina? After I dismiss them, can she finish the
I could just
so that I can still show it?
talk to an empty room.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know how it works exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Miss Grant, did you want me to stop the broadcast? No.